Hello, all, and welcome to Club Book with Melanie Benjamin, the finale event capping our busy spring season. Before I introduce tonight's guest properly, allow me a moment to tell you a bit more about the unique series that is bringing her to us. Club Book is a program of MELSA, the Metropolitan Library Service Agency, made possible through the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund and coordinated by Library Strategies, part of the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. Dakota County Library is the co-organizer of this evening's talk. I am the moderator, Sheila O'Connor, the author of 6 novels, and I'm delighted to be in conversation with Melanie. I want to also say thanks to our partnering bookseller, Red Balloon Bookshop. A purchase link to California Golden will be available in the comments section of this live stream feed. Have it shipped, pick it up at their lovely store in St. Paul, or have them deliver it personally to your door if you're close to the area. One final housekeeping note, also in the comments, you'll see a survey link. Melsa would greatly appreciate hearing what you think of this Club Book program. It's quick and easy. Our guest tonight, Melanie Benjamin, is an acknowledged master of historical fiction, not to mention one of the genre's best-selling authors. Benjamin's growing collection of work profiles topics ranging from the Nazi occupation of Paris to silent movie starlet Mary Pickford to the real-life inspiration behind Alice and Wonderland. Her most popular novels to date include The Aviator's Wife, the story of the aviatrix spouse of Charles Lindbergh, The Swans of Fifth Avenue, about the headline-making relationship between famed author Truman Capote and a New York socialite, and The Children's Blizzard, which breathes new life into an infamous 1988 blizzard that still holds distinction as one of the most deadly natural disasters to ever hit the Great Plains. Her latest, California Golden, turns the spotlight to Malibu in the 1960s and the formative but factious genesis of California surf culture. Booklist touts Benjamin's novel shows what the sun-kissed highlight reels so often missed. After a short talk by our guest and some initial questions from me, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Simply drop your questions in the comments thread here on Facebook, and our tech manager will route them to me. You can also send a message to Club Book through Facebook Messenger or email, where we're at clubbookmin@gmail.com. And now I'm going to turn it over to Melanie. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sheila, and thank you all. I'm honored that I'm the end of the grand finale of this season. I didn't know that. That's exciting. I am going to attempt to impersonate a smart person right now by sharing my screen. See if I can do that. All right. This is a big one for me. It's the first. I think it worked. I hope you all can see it. I am screen sharing. So let me just get right into the book so we have a lot of time to talk afterwards. California Golden was published this past August. It begins in 1950s sunny California, where Carol Donnelly is a mother who would rather be Gidget than Donna Reed. She becomes an iconic female surfer during a time when women really weren't welcome on the waves, but in doing so, in pursuing her passion, she often abandons her young daughters. The 2 daughters, the little girls, decide to come up with a plan. They're going to learn how to surf in order to keep up with their mother. And as time goes on, the older daughter, Mindy, is a natural. She surpasses her mother on the waves, which leads to its own problems. She becomes a minor celebrity in those beach party movies, but the younger sister, Ginger, cannot keep up, and she gets sucked down into the counterculture of the 1960s, drugs and cults. And it is the 2 sisters' journey back to each other against the psychedelic backdrop of the 1960s that is the heart of the book. And this is a book about mothers and daughters and sisters and generational trauma and the stifling limitations against women that they came up against in the 1950s and 1960s. So, California girls, California dreamin', surfing USA. Oh, wait a minute, this is not. Right, suddenly I'm not able to, there we go. Okay, Surfing USA. This is a sunny, nostalgic setting and time period that really appealed to me as a novelist. I am always trying to push myself as an author, and I wanted to write about women within a specific historical context, as I have done before, but this time I made a decision to pivot a bit and to write something with a bit more of a contemporary feeling to it. And I thought this setting could be sexy and fun. And my memories of this specific cultural moment are pretty stereotypical. I thought the surf scene in California in those early days was like one fun, fabulous beach party, one endless summer. But like most things, that is only part of the truth. That's the marketable, aspirational part. There is so much more to surfing in California and women of that era. When we talk about surfing, we need to talk about cultural appropriation. The first historical mention of surfing is in Polynesia. There are cave drawings there going back to the 12th century that depict people surfing. It likely was common decade or generations, centuries prior to that, because when the Polynesians paddled to Hawaii in about 1000 AD, they brought the culture of surfing with them. And the oldest known surfboard known to man was discovered in a burial cave in Hawaii, and it belonged to a Hawaiian princess. So all Hawaiians surfed, male, female, king, queen, present, then they often surfed naked, like this drawing depicts. And when the Protestant missionaries showed up in Hawaii in the early 1800s, of course, they squashed that notion right away. You know, Protestants taking away everybody's fun since 1517. The missionaries were intent on eliminating pretty much every part of native Hawaiian culture, and of course, surfing was part of that. But in the mid to 1800s, Hawaii was discovered by tourists. And these tourists wanted to learn about native culture, which included surfing. And people figured out a way to make money teaching people how to surf. And then it became popular again. Mark Twain surfed in Hawaii. So did Jack London and his wife. They were taught by Hawaiian watermen, legendary surfers and swimmers and divers who were employed by wealthy white men owning hotels to teach tourists how to surf. And of course, some of these tourists then brought the idea back to the mainland. But it was really one person in particular who is responsible for bringing surfing first to the United States and then later to Australia. And that person is Duke Kahanamoku. He was born into minor Hawaiian nobility in 1890. He became a legendary swimmer and diver and surfer, and he won a bunch of medals in the Olympics. And this is Duke with his traditional Hawaiian board. This is a wooden board. It weighed 114 pounds and it was 16 feet tall. Duke came to the mainland, then California, in the 1920s and 30s as part of kind of a tour, a publicity tour. And he gave surfing exhibits to Hollywood stars, and he taught many of them how to surf himself. He did some stunt work in movies, and he's also rescued several people in a boating accident off the shore of Newport Beach using his board. And this was highly publicized at a time, this heroic rescue. And it is responsible for every lifeguard incorporating a surfboard in their rescue gear to this day. And he was the first person to be inducted in both the Swimming and the Surfing Hall of Fame. So how did this native Polynesian custom become synonymous with blonde California girls and boys? You know, that's kind of the $1 million question. After the war, World War II, with oil and military and aviation industries really exploding in Southern California, suddenly there were lots of men living on the coast or near the coast, far more than there were before the war, far more than in Hawaii. And as surfing started to become popular, little by little through the 40s, then into the 50s, there were a lot more white California guys surfing than anywhere else in the world, with the exception possibly of Australia. And it might have something to do with the area of the mainland where it became popular in Southern California, you know, La La Land, Hollywood. This area was then and is now the center of pop culture, with giant mouthpieces to amplify it across the globe through movies and television and music and magazines. But before all that happened, before it really became popular, in the 1950s, surfing in California was really kind of an outlaw thing to do. They were called, the men who were drawn to surfing were called surf bums for a reason. They tended to be dropouts from society. And surfing, the surf life as they perceived it, was all about living on the beach and waiting for that perfect wave. And in those years, it's important to remember, I think, in the years depicted in my novel, surfing wasn't about big wave surfing the way it is today. In those years, the most popular beach in California was Malibu, and it has a very famous long ride of a very perfect, but it's a pretty tame wave compared to what people surf today. But sometime in the 1950s, these mainland surf bums heard of a place in Hawaii called Makaha, where the waves were much bigger. And the idea of a surfing safari was born. Mainlanders, mostly men, went to Hawaii during the fall and winter months, where the surf there is the best, to just simply live on the beaches and surf and throw their surfboards in the back of a truck and drive off to catch the next big wave. And this is depicted in the wonderful documentary Endless Summer in the 1960s, only that was kind of global. And of course, not many women at that time could do this, with one exception, which I'll get to later. So in the 1950s, when the mother of my book, Carol Donnelly, becomes one of these first pioneering female surfers, it wasn't a cool thing to do. And actually, in the book, her daughters are kind of embarrassed by this at first. It took a tiny 15-year-old girl to really put surfing on the cultural map. And in the summer of 1956, a 15-year-old teenager named Kathy Kohner was bored, as most teenagers are during summer vacation. So she just decided to start hanging out at her neighborhood beach, which was Malibu. There, she discovered an old tiki hut full of surf bums named Hoopsteak and the Cat and the Mongoose. They all went by nicknames. Nobody ever used the real name. A lot of them were wanted by the law. They were all living at the beach. They were surfing all day long, and there were other girls about, sure, but these girls were eye candy, beach bunnies in bikinis, watching the guys. Kathy wanted none of that. She was a tomboy, and she wanted to learn how to surf like these guys. They wouldn't let her at first. So she quickly realized these guys had no money and were hungry all the time. So she went home, smart girl that she was, went home, made a bunch of sandwiches, drove back to the beach, and traded sandwiches for a used board and some surf lessons. The guys reluctantly agreed, and they adopted her as a kind of mascot, nicknaming her Gidget, which is a mashup of girl midget, different times. And one thing that is important to remember around this time, surfboards were suddenly much lighter than they had been in Duke's time. They were being made of fiberglass now, not wood. And that was a lot easier for women to be able to surf then. Back home, Kathy's father, Frederick Kohner, overheard her talking on the phone to her friends about this fun time she was having at the beach, and he started to eavesdrop. Frederick Kohner was an Austrian Jewish emigre who had come to Hollywood long before the war. He was a popular screenwriter, and he thought that his daughter's adventures, complete with an entire new language no one had heard of, including words like bitchin' and gnarly, he thought it would make an interesting book, so he wrote it. It's a little unsettling when you think about it, because he basically stole his daughter's life. Apparently, when he told her what he was doing, she did cooperate. He also, in the book itself, if you've read it, he explores her budding sexuality in a way that's a little unsettling as well. But only his name appeared on the original book. Although the cover of the book, this is a photo of Kathy, of the actual Gidget. When the book was reissued in the 90s, Kathy wrote an introduction to it, and finally her name appeared on the book. And when it was published in 1957, the book, Gidget, the little girl with big ideas, it was such an instant sensation. It is hard to describe what an overnight, like earthquake this was. Overnight, surfing had become cool, and teenagers flocked to the beach in a way that they hadn't really before this book came out. Now, of course, the core surfing community was not pleased by this. They wanted their women, looking decorative on the beach. They really didn't want them riding the waves. Kathy was the exception. So the women who wanted to be like Gidget, they were sometimes shoved off their boards. They were often, assaulted with sexual language and always told to go home and cook dinner. And what they didn't realize, again, it was that Gidget was the exception, not the rule, but that didn't matter to all the teenage girls who wanted to be her. Now, when the movie starring Sandra Dee came out in 1958, and then this later became a television series starring an unknown Sally Field, it spawned an entire cultural movement, including the beach party movies starring Frankie and Annette, and an entire genre of music, of course, embodied by not only the Beach Boys, but Dick Dale and his Deltones and Jan and Dean. Suddenly, magazines, sprouted up about this wonderful, new amazing way to live. And every kid in America wanted to be a California girl or boy. They wanted to live on the beach. They wanted to catch the waves. They wanted to party around the bonfires. And this is the moment when surfing becomes synonymous with white teenagers. They became the face of the lifestyle. Fun, fun, fun till her daddy took the T-bird away. But beneath all the sunshine and copper tone, there were darker things lurking. And I don't know if you have ever heard of a movie called Surf Nazis Must Die. And it is a very schlocky B movie, but there is some truth in it because there were actual surf Nazis. Once white men appropriated surfing, it became a very racist sport, and it sadly still is today. And in the 1960s, these blonde California guys thought it was super cool to surf in Nazi jackets or Nazi helmets or give the Heil Hitler salute. And this racism even spread to poor little Gidget. Some of that original Malibu crew who had adopted little Kathy Conner and nicknamed her Gidget, once they found out that she was Jewish, they spray painted a cross on her driveway in front of her house. And that is not in the book or in the movies. Also drug running too. In the 1960s, a lot of these outlaw surf dudes started going south to Mexico with their surfboards, ostensibly surfing like in Baja. They started buying up lots of cheap pot, and then they would hollow out their surfboards and stash the pot in the surfboard, wax it over, and take it back across the border to sell at the surfing competitions that were starting to spring up. So surfing and drugs really became synonymous in the 1960s, and this is depicted in my novel. So, the 1950s. Didn't women really, really love their appliances back then? I mean, how happy are they? June Cleaver, Harriet Nelson. After World War II, famously, we all know women were told to go leave the factories and go home, stay home, have babies in order to keep America free from those darn commies. And that is actually an ideal that was espoused in Congress and talked about on the floor of Congress. And in all the advertising and all the movies and television shows in the 1950s, this is the prevailing theme. In the movies of the 1950s, if a girl was single and chose to have a career instead of getting married, she was always punished in some way, or by the end of the movie, ended up marrying the boss anyway. I was recently watching a movie on TCM, which is my favorite TV cable station, called The Tender Trap, and it stars Debbie Reynolds, and it was made in 1955. And in that movie, even though she is promised Broadway stardom, all Debbie wants to do throughout that entire film is marry Frank Sinatra and have his babies. There were very few single women portrayed on television, with the exception of soap operas. This was a time when most women went to college with the expectation that the only degree they were going to get was their MRS degree. And the median age of women being married for the very first time actually went down in the 1950s from where it had been in the 30s and 40s. So predominant was this narrative: to marry and to have children is the highest calling a woman can have. Another interesting note I learned: in the 1940s, single women could legally adopt children. By the 1950s, the laws were rewritten and no longer could. Or as Mamie Eisenhower once famously put it, Ike runs the country and I turn the pork chops. But some women didn't want to be June Cleaver. They wanted to be Gidget. In my book, the mother character, Carol Donnelly, is very loosely inspired by this real surf icon on the right, Marge Calhoun. I was intrigued by these photos of Marge and her daughters. The three of them were competitive surfers and competed together. And I really wanted to explore that idea of a mother and her daughters competing together in this time when women were not exactly welcome on the waves. And they weren't known for this. And in learning about Marge Calhoun, who is today remembered as the first female world champion surfer, and who did go on a surfing safari in the 1950s and left her daughters behind, this is something I portray in the book. I did have a lot of sympathy for her and other women like her. Sympathy for women who didn't want to be the stereotypical housewife. And I concentrated on athletic women, which is, I'm not an athletic woman myself, so it's not something I'd ever thought of before. But I learned how very few opportunities there were for women in athletics beyond high school sports, with a couple of exceptions, tennis, ice skating. The few who did find a way to pursue their passions outside the normal gender constraints, of course, face a lot of backlash, as I've talked about, obstacles, ridicule. In surfing, for example, and this is true today, women are always given the worst waves for their part of the competition. If during the weekend of a tournament, the forecast is for only one good day of waves, that day is always earmarked for the men, and the girls have to make do in the mush. And of course, then as now, they won far less money than their male counterparts, and there were far fewer sponsorship opportunities. So I want to make it clear, Carol Donnelly is not Marge Calhoun. They share the surfing safari and daughters, but the women in my book have stories that I made up. But the Carol character in my book is a star athlete who has dreams of playing in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, but her dreams are shattered and she becomes pregnant in high school. And so she never accepts this life that she has to live. She rebels against it by learning how to surf. And she breaks her family's heart, yes. And she does incredible damage to her daughters. She isn't a good mother. She's a disaster for a wife. She should never have been either, but that wasn't an option in the late 1940s and 50s. Now, I have written about iconic women before in my books, but for every trailblazer, especially if she's a woman, especially of that era, there are those who get left behind. And in this book, for the first time, I focus more on those whose lives are damaged by the iconic woman, in this case, her daughters. But Carol's story is still important. We don't always talk about the emotional toll that women paid in the 1940s and the 1950s and into the 1960s, the whole Diary of a Mad Housewife thing of it all. But despite Cheryl's many, many shortcomings in the book, I do hope by the time you finish the book, you have some kind of understanding of why she was that way. So, reviews of my book called it overstuffed. And yeah, because the 1960s were an overstuffed decade. When I first started writing this book, I thought I was only going to go up into the early 1960s, but as the two sisters grew and took very different paths, I realized that their individual journeys had to cover the entire decade. So yeah, their stories reflect many of the seminal moments of the 1960s. Groovy celebrity, the LA music scene at Whiskey A Go-Go, Go-Go Boots, the whole beach party thing, drugs and cults. And this is a photo of some of the members of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, which was a surfing cult based in Laguna Beach. And they manufactured LSD and smuggled drugs all the way from like Afghanistan. And they also broke Timothy Leary out of jail. And of course, Vietnam is a big part of my novel as well. But let's think about all the other things that happened in the 60s. So many of them taking place in California that I didn't put in the book. I don't mention JFK's assassination, Martin Luther King's assassination, the Watts riots, which happened in LA, Bobby Kennedy's assassination, which happened in LA, Altamont, which was California, the Summer of Love, California, and the Manson murders, LA. They're not even in my book, but yes, my novel is overstuffed because anyone who lived through the 1960s knows that decade as one of the most tumultuous decades in American history. And I do think that suddenly this is very popular right now in historical fiction. And yes, sorry, folks. This has been a subject of debate by some of my readers. They don't like it that the 1960s now qualifies as historical fiction, but it's true. It's like when your favorite song is now suddenly on the oldies station on Pandora. California Golden is definitely now consigned to historical fiction, the 1960s. So speaking of historical fiction, as I wrap this up now, I've also had a few reviews and reviewers refer to me as the prolific Melanie Benjamin. And I'll be honest, I don't think it's always intended as a compliment. Sometimes I think it's a dig, and sometimes I think I take it that way because in publishing in general, with a certain type of fiction, there seems to be a bit of suspicion when an author doesn't take 5 years to produce a book. I have published 8 books in 12 years and completed 2 others that I didn't feel comfortable publishing because I didn't think they were good enough. So what does that say about me? Well, I think I have finally, in my later years now, come around to acknowledging that it says I'm good at what I do. Um, Writing is my one talent. Believe me, I have no other marketable skills, and I am not going to do the imposter syndrome anymore. I'm 61, and I think I'm finally accepting the fact and owning the fact that I'm talented. I don't have children at home. My husband makes a very good living, and I don't need a second job. So why wouldn't I be prolific? So yeah, I'm owning it. I am the prolific Melanie Benjamin. However, I have taken a little bit of sabbatical over the last couple of years since I turned in California Golden to my editor. As I said, I'm a little older, and I think I'm at an age where, as a woman, maybe more than men, you do start to wonder if your voice is still relevant, in the face of all these, younger readers and different trends. And, when we get this age, life has a way of throwing you more curveballs than it used to. But I do feel like I'm ready to get back in the saddle again, because after a lot of reflection, because publishing is a tough business, the business part of it is, and tougher today than it's ever been for writers like me. And I needed to evaluate whether or not I wanted to keep fighting those battles. But I have acknowledged that I never want to stop writing. I need to keep telling stories of women, stories of historical events or cultural moments about women, real or imagined, who grew beyond the constraints of their time. Women who have stories that only I can tell. In California Golden, the ocean is a metaphor for life. It's always there in the book, always, always. And it can bring life and it can bring death. And sometimes the surface looks peaceful and calm, but always there's danger lurking beneath the surface. And just like the Donnelly girls in California Golden, I have to keep looking for that perfect wave. And I've had some real good ones in the past, and I'm ready to find more in my future. So thank you. I'm looking forward to talking with Sheila now. And I will stop sharing my screen. Okay.
That was an incredible presentation. Especially, as deeply as I went into this book, I loved hearing about, all of the research that, well, of course, this isn't all the research you did, but just the different moments and parts of the research that you were focused on in this talk. And also just the process of writing now and having done, as many books as you've done, which is quite an achievement. So I'm going to talk and ask about in general, like you've had this terrific career writing historical fiction, and what draws you to that genre? I think there's something, for each writer, it's a particular thing, but what pulls you back to fiction or to history all the time when you're looking at story?
I mean, some people I think are just amateur historians and armchair historians, I guess you could call them. And I've always believed that's I am. I mean, history is always one of my favorite subjects in school, and my bookshelves are full of histories and biographies, nonfiction. I'm just very interested in the past. And I think more and more these days, I understand the past more than maybe I understand the present.
Yeah.
And certainly more than I'm interested in the future. And and maybe there's a comfort in it for me to escape to different times. And I'm not saying they were always better times, because certainly they were not, especially for women. But I am always, as much as I find comfort in the past, or just really interested and imagining myself, because I'm the imagination thing. I'm always kind of inserting myself into different decades and different moments in history. But I am always trying to find the relevance to today as well.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's what women were up against, in a racist or sexist society, or in sports in general. I mean, again, there's so many parallels that are still today's. I am always looking for something that will definitely, allow contemporary readers to, one, learn something new, because I am always told that about my books, that people appreciate learning about something they didn't know. And also help them kind of ground the past in the present, in a way that's relatable.
So you have this spark, something you come upon this. In this case, it was the history of the surfing culture in Malibu in the 60s. And then could you talk a little bit then about your process? So for example, is your first step to immerse yourself in the research, or do you begin with the idea of a story, in this case of the mother and the sisters, and then do the research as the plot begins to unfold? Or is there like a chunk of months or something in which you're sort of, I need to learn everything I can learn about this, and then I'm going to start writing?
So it always starts with the idea. Um, and I didn't start out writing historical fiction. My first two novels were contemporary, under my real name. And then I accidentally wrote a book that happened to be historical fiction, and I didn't know it. My agent told me it was, and that's how I embarked upon a new career as Melanie Benjamin. So it's all about the idea, and that gets harder with every book, because since I've been writing historical fiction with Alice, I have been in 2010. That genre got really, really big in the mid 2000s, like, after myself and Paula McLean and Nancy Horan and some other authors kind of started writing about real women. All of a sudden, many, many, many authors were jumping on this bandwagon and snatching up all the interesting women to write about. So it's always been really kind of harder and harder with every book to come up with an idea that's marketable, because that is important, but also an idea that I want to write about and spend a lot of time with, because that is something I've learned, that you're always, if a book is a success, you will be talking about that book and that subject of that book for the rest of your life, and you have to really, really like it. So it always starts with the idea. Like, I'll go back and use Alice I Have Been, my first historical novel, as an example. And this is how I became a historical novelist with no training and absolutely zero idea how to do it. But I just found a formula that worked for me. I found a photograph. I saw a photograph at an art museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, of a 7-year-old Alice Little, who was, the caption simply said that she was a daughter of the Dean of Christ Church, Oxford, where Charles Dodgson, aka Lewis Carroll, was a professor, and she was the inspiration for Alice in Wonderland. I didn't know there'd ever been a real little girl named Alice, and I thought it was really interesting that there had been. And there was something about the photograph and the photographer behind the camera, something in the connection there that made me wonder about the relationship, the nature of the relationship. So I went and did some cursory research into the basic outlines of Alice Little, the real Alice Little, and discovered that there was a whole lot of scandal attached to what was the true nature of the relationship. Were letters burned by the mother, and then found out that Alice had a very, very long, eventful, tragic, in a lot of ways, life, but yet by the end of her life seemed to embrace her past, her legacy as Alice, this thing that I think she'd been trying to put behind. And I thought, well, that sounds like a really good novel. So then I did more research. And I had no money at the time. I couldn't go to Oxford, England, where the book takes place, to research it. It didn't have the funds. And so I had to content myself with reading a lot of books and looking at a lot of photos. And the internet has been a great help for me. I'm not sure I could do this without the internet. And I learned with that first book, I was obsessed. One moment, I was obsessed with whether or not Alice was stepped up or down to go into the garden of the deanery at Oxford. It seemed suddenly was an important detail I needed to put in the book, and the book wouldn't work without it. And then I finally realized, no, if they're worried about whether she steps up or down, I am not doing my job as a novelist in creating a compelling story and characters. And that's when I learned it's about the people, it's about the characters, and it's about the story I want to tell. The details matter, but they cannot overwhelm the book. So that the research I do is not nearly as in-depth as most people think. For one thing, I'm always been writing about eras, which I have a pretty comfortable knowledge about anyway. Say Victorian England, I knew the way people spoke. I knew what the clothing was. I knew what they ate. There are always details you have to get about, what was a train car? What did it look like in 1858? You have to go in for those details, but I have learned that I have to concentrate on the characters, and I have to craft one story out of a lifetime of many, many stories that I can hang the narrative on. Like, for example, with The Aviator's Wife, it was the story of Mary Lindbergh, but I decided to make it the story of their marriage. So other things that happened in their lives, I didn't research necessarily beyond, reading biographies, but they weren't relevant to the story I want to tell. So I do have to come up with a subject and a basic idea of the story I want to tell. And then I do the research that's relevant to that and know more. And I have learned that I have a danger of over-researching. If I allow myself to read every letter written by this person and every diary entry, it stifles my imagination, and I cannot make the book come to life. And I get too concerned about putting every detail in, and that's not important. It really isn't important. It's important enough to ground the reader in the time and the place, and certainly, to not make it unbelievable, but it's the characters, man. It's the story. That's my imagination is my greatest tool.
Yeah. Well, that leads right to the next question that I have for you, which is that, history is the backdrop and it's also the rich fabric of your work. But really, for me, it's, what I found most impressive in California Golden was the complex, conflicted characters and their story. That is the heart of the book. That's not just historical information. That's people that we care about, and we care about what happens to them as the novel unfolds. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about, the Donley women as sort of a unit, and then I have a couple of questions about them as individuals. So, Ginger, the youngest sister, I think she is in some ways the most frustrating of the trio, because although I found her entirely believable as a vulnerable follower who sort of struggles to think for herself, because she's also been the younger sister to the older sister who's made all of the decisions. And again, as a second born, I'm like, oh my God, I totally understand the psychology of Ginger, even if I would have gone in her direction. But you do an amazing job looking at her choices and her motivations, especially when we get into that really thorny territory of her blind devotion to that abusive partner.
Right.
And I guess that what I was especially interested in as a writer to a writer is, were there things that you came to understand about Ginger yourself as the person creating her that encouraged compassion for you rather than judgment? Because I think often when we have a character like Ginger, we know people are going to judge her, so the challenge is how to come to that character with compassion.
Oh, absolutely. Every character in my books, no matter how evil or despicable they might be in their actions in the end, I come to from a point of compassion and trying to understand why they did the things that they did. Whether it's Charles Lindbergh, who famously had a whole stash of secret children over in Europe that he supposedly didn't tell his wife about. And who was a very controlling man and very difficult husband and father. But yet I tried to find I had to have compassion for him. Truman Capote in the Swans of Fifth Avenue, who did despicable things to the people he supposedly loved. But, it often comes down to the childhood. You have to often, when you're researching, you find the childhood. You go, oh, I get it. So in creating Ginger, because this was only the second time in a novel of mine that I've created the characters out of my own imagination, loosely inspired, but really they're my creation. I always look for the heart of the book, and Ginger to me was the raw, beating, needy part of this book. And that's how I thought of her, is she's just a walking wounded heart. And coming, and understanding, as I write the scenes of their childhood, I'm writing them to create, I knew what her arc was going to be in large part. I mean, I always allow the writing to take me on little journeys, but overall, I have the art of the main characters before I start writing in my head. So I knew what her relationship with this man was going to be, and I knew she was going to get involved in the cults and the drugs. So I had to decide why, and that's what you create in the childhood. And so yeah, I mean, I know people are not going to understand her decisions in this novel, and they will frustrate some people. But I also, don't we all know women who make questionable decisions about relationships? And so I thought, okay, she's that woman to an extreme, but also it goes back to the childhood, the abandonment by their mother and their father, and the two of them together, and her feeling always second best to Mindy, the older sister, and coming to see herself as having been a burden on her sister, but needing love in a way that I don't think Mindy seemed to need the love, that Ginger was deprived of unconditional love as a child. Or so
Yes.
she thought. And she's always looking for it.
Yeah, you do an incredible job mining the history of these girls as children, and also the long reach of childhood trauma and the
Yes.
way that it continues to inform the choices they make, even if the choice is to try to be, for Mindy, hyper successful or recognized, or to overcome her sense of worthlessness through poverty and
Shame.
neglect.
Yeah, the shame. Yeah.
You do this really beautifully, and you also do it with the mother, who is responsible for the childhood trauma that these girls, and the father too, of course, but the mother stars in the book,
Yeah.
and that's just another thing that I think you do incredibly well, is you call us to consider what were the forces that led to the mother's actions, because again, she's somebody you could quickly judge, write off, and discard, like,
Right.
well, she was a terrible mother. So but I'm asking sort of the same question about her. Were there things you came to understand through writing about her?
Yeah, definitely. As I said, that I'm an armchair historian, I firmly believe novelists have to be armchair psychiatrists.
Right.
I mean, we have to be willing to understand why people do the things that they do and convey them compassionately and relatably on the page, whether or not they're happening in 1920 or 1950 or 2010 or 2023. We have to. I mean, I mean, plot is important, but I'm a firm believer that it's character over plot. Okay, I mean, again, plot. You have to have a plot. You have to, but but the people within caught up in that plot have to be believable people. They have to be understandable, believable people, even if they do bad things. That's so you have to find the thing that makes them do the things that drive the plot. And with Carol, it really, I didn't, in researching just women in the 1940s and a little bit about the real life woman, Marge Calhoun, who had been actually on the path to be an Olympic swimmer when the Olympics were cut short because they didn't happen because of World War II. So I thought about that, the idea of a thwarted, someone whose dreams were just stolen from her.
Yes.
And I think we think about, a lot of times when we write about iconic women, they tend to be scientists or musicians or painters. I don't know that we write a lot about athletic women, but their passion, for sport or for their self-worth, their identity at a young age is this. It's the physical thing. It's the sport that they love. And when they're denied that, whether it's because the Olympics are cut short or because they get pregnant on prom night, and there's a war on, and your duty is to marry the guy going off to war so that he will come home safely. That is traumatic. And I think it can really traumatize a person and stunt them. And I know it can. It happens every day, all the time. And that was Carol's.
Yeah.
That was the root of her thing.
these are the really powerful pieces, I think, about the book, over and above all the fabulous history and subject of surfing that's in there. So I'm going to go to the audience questions now. And somebody's asking about your personal affiliation and affection with Malibu and the surf culture. Do you have one?
Well, I love California. I would love to have maybe grown up in California. I do, and we vacate. My husband and I actually do a timeshare thing in Newport Beach, and we go there every year for 2 weeks. And we usually rent a sports car and pretend that we can live there for 2 weeks, and then of course we can't afford it, and we go back home. But so and Hollywood was one of my biggest fascinations. I've written one book about Hollywood, and unfortunately, it's never embraced as an idea. I have a million Hollywood stories I would like to tell, but I love Southern California. I just love it. I did not put myself on a surfboard for this book. At the time I was writing this, I was a 59-year-old woman with half an ACL, and there was no way I was going to get up on a surfboard and try to learn how to surf. This is where the imagination comes in. But yeah, I mean, I love to be in coastal California, and Laguna Beach, which is mentioned in the novel, and I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorite places on earth. I mean, if I had all the money in the world, that's where I would retire. So yeah, I do love California. And so that is a big part of why I wanted to spend some time there in writing this book. Yeah.
So I'm going to jump to another one. Somebody had asked, since you have a penchant for over researching, what is a fact you tried to weave into a prior novel but couldn't manage to? And
oh gosh,
tell us now. I mean, I know the thing you're trying to, in my own experience with historical fiction, it's like, oh, I want this in there. I want this in there.
I mean, I don't think I have a penchant for over researching anymore. It's rare that I do it. I've learned to focus on what I need to know, a need to know basis. So, but there are always things that you would love to include that you can't. And I'm trying to think of something specific to this. This is just a silly little thing, but I don't have this in the book, don't I? Yeah, that part of the competition in the early days was a part of the sport was called tandem surfing. I don't know if I have this in the book, but I thought it was really fascinating, in which a man and a female would paddle out, and then they would be judged on the acrobats that they did on the board as they surfed in. So like usually it's the man holding the woman up above his head and down by the side, or handstands and things like that. And I thought that was really hysterically funny. And you can see old footage of people doing this back in the day, but that didn't make it in the book. I think I could have explored a lot more of the Native Hawaiian surfers who did come over to the mainland and were not real welcome for the surfing competitions. There's some of that in there. I mean, I certainly would have loved to put more about Hawaii in there, but I think we're all learning as we get older and as society evolves, that there are some stories that are not mine to tell. So I am really couldn't really truly put as much of the Hawaiian point of view in the novel as perhaps I might have wanted to. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are things, but I am just blanking. As I like to tell people, I turned the book in 2 years ago now, coming up on 2 years ago, which means I started writing it a year before that. So it's basically been 3 years since I've researched this book, and I've slept some since then.
Things
have
left your memory.
61.
Yes,
I don't remember.
Yes, I know. It's funny because the book does seem far away by the time you're out talking to people about it. You're like,
that's
wait, I don't remember it as
that.
really as the people just reading it. So somebody had asked about, did you do, and I know the answer to this already, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it, about the research you did into the counterculture movement and historical happenings from the era.
What's the question?
It was, did you do research into the counterculture movement?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is, a good part of the chunk of this is in the novel. But the Brotherhood of Eternal Sunshine, So where my favorite place in the world is Laguna Beach, and the Mystic Arts Cafe, where they had a head store back in the day, and was registered as a church so that they could actually keep it open. It's a whole thing. It's still there, but it's not that anymore. It's changed. But that whole, yeah, that was real fascinating to me, learning about that cult in particular with David Griggs, or Greg Griggs, the founder of it. And there is a lot I learned about them that is not in the book, particularly about how that they ended up being there were lots of raids. They had a commune, as I depict in the book, up the hills in Laguna, up the hills from the beach. And it was regularly raided by police. They were down in Laguna itself constantly. Their whole thing was peace, love, and understanding through the magic power of LSD. And Maui Wowie, that's what they developed.
Oh.
And they actually, there was a concert on the beach in Laguna at one point. They rented a plane and they dropped acid tablets from the plane onto the beach goers. And I mean, that was their thing. They thought, but it became a business too. Then certain members of the cult understood that there was a lot of money to be made in this. And so then it became under the eye of the FBI, and there were raids. But it was a true commune like you imagine of the 1960s, with everybody living together and kids running around, unsupervised. And there's a really interesting documentary or two about it. So yeah, that was really kind of interesting to me. I am not a person who would ever have been tempted to live in a cult, but but I just thought that had to be there, because one of the things I like in historical fiction, or any kind of fiction, is the tension between the culture and the counterculture. And in this book, it is literally each sister represents one thing, and I love that tension. That was a big part of the book.
And one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking about this, that's a great gift of historical fiction, is, say somebody comes upon something in the book, they can dive deeper into it. They can come out of this book and say, wow, I knew nothing about this. I'm going to start reading about it. I do this immediately. I get on the internet and I start reading about it, or checking out.
I hope people do that. That's
library.
always, yeah, I hear that a lot. And on my website, for every one of my books, there is the World of kind of book, a webpage specific to each book, where you can find a lot more information that is not actually in the book based on some of my research, and links of interest to help you find out more. So it's easily navigatable on my through my website for every one of my historical novels. There is that. And also at the end of every book, there is the author's note, where I share many of the books and resources I used for research. Yes. Again, in the hope that you are inspired to go learn more yourself.
Yes, I loved your author's note. It was terrific. So I'm going to ask just one more question. Which of your protagonists have you found most relatable? Who would you most like as a friend? And this person says, I would love to have partied with Babe and her swans.
Yeah, the Swans of Fifth Avenue had another little moment with the recent feud that was not based on my book, sadly. Darn it. But very much about the same thing. So yeah, I understand asking about Babe. I would have to say relatable, sadly, is probably Truman Capote. Not that I want him to be my friend. I don't want him to be my friend, but I actually related to him in a really disturbing way that troubled me when I was writing that book. Like his scenes were by far the easiest and most fun for me to write. Was his dialogue and his outlook.
He's a really tremendous character.
Yeah, but I truly did relate to him. And again, it goes back to the childhood, because I got to learn about his very traumatic childhood. And actually, after the book came out, I was invited to do a fundraiser in Monroeville, Alabama, hometown of Truman Capote and Harper Lee, where I discovered an awful lot of. I talked to a cousin of his who shared some of their family stories and his memories of Truman when he had come to visit, and that the town never embraced him. They always shunned him because he was gay. And it was kind of some sad stories he told me about the way he was still being treated in the 60s and 70s that really but that was after I wrote the book. And as far as who I'd like to party with the most, you know what? Mrs. Tom Thumb and Lavinia Warren Stratton from my second novel, The Autobiography of Mrs. Tom Thumb. I'd love for her to be my friend. That woman had so much drive and energy, and I think she would be fun to party with.
Thank you. So I'm afraid this is all we have time for this evening, but I could talk to you a long time, Melanie.
Yeah, same here, Sheila.
And thank you so much for penciling us into your busy spring. That's terrific. And thank you for a fascinating conversation and a wonderful presentation. I've learned so much just chatting with you here this evening.
Yeah.
This has been a virtual presentation of Club Book, a long-running literary series of MELSA made possible by the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Special thanks again to Dakota County Library for the part they played in bringing Melanie to us. Yes, thank you. Before you log off, look for the Club Book survey link, which is in the comments and will be projected in place of my video momentarily. Club Book will be back after Labor Day with a new slate of great author guests, some appearing virtually, others joining Club Book in person at public library venues across the Twin Cities Metro. Sign up for their e-newsletter available at clubbook.org to be among the first to learn when the new announcements drop. And thank you again for joining us this evening.